Welcome everyone to Coffee with the Chaplain, and where we discuss different topics, whatever it is that I think might be interesting or important to us. And I want to appreciate your allowing me to share this with you. Today our title is one word: serendipity. Serendipity. And I'm going to define that as discovering gifts in unlikely places. Serendipity is when something comes out of the blue that we didn't expect, but it turns out to be a good thing. So I would like to tell a story that begins in one place and ends in another. So if you'll be patient with me, you'll discover we end up winding around to where we want to be. But it's a story that I think will take us there. Many of you know the Reverend Stephen Parks from the Annunciation Catholic Church just down the road. He's been a pastor and priest at Annunciation for a number of years. He has been on our campus to visit and care for and pray with many of our residents. He was recently named to be the 15th bishop of the Catholic Diocese of Savannah, Georgia. And for a couple of months, he's been in a transition. But when this segment of Coffee with the Chaplain airs on Wednesday the 23rd, this will be the day that he is ordained and installed in the Diocese of Savannah, Georgia. If you would like, you can look onto the Diocese of Savannah, Georgia's website, and they will be streaming it live, because under the virus, it'll be just a small group who will be there. Well, hearing that Father Parks is now in Savannah reminds me of Savannah and the history and how interesting I think the city is. It is one of my favorite places to visit. I've been there several times. And my wife and I had a wonderful trip a couple of years ago where we stayed downtown and didn't have to drive anywhere. We walked. We had perfect weather and walked from historic place to historic place under the big oak trees from one square to another. And we even saw the bench and square where Forrest Gump, the movie, was filmed. But one of the historic locations there in Savannah is the Catholic Cathedral. It is a beautiful building, and when you go inside, you discover that it's more of a French-inspired design that is unique, I think, from what I've seen around many other churches in that area or across the South. Now, there are other notable buildings, of course, including some notable churches, two of which I'll name. Christ Church Episcopal, which was founded in 1733. It calls itself the Mother Church of Georgia because it was established along with the establishment of Georgia as an English colony. And although I believe the building is not the first building, the church organization itself was the first established in the entire state of Georgia. The other notable church building is Wesley Monumental, that's an impressive name, United Methodist Church, established in 1807. Wesley Monumental. That leads me to the next little segment of our story. John Wesley. I mentioned the historic Episcopal and Methodist churches because my first visit to Savannah was attending a church conference that met at some point in the 2 or 3 days when I was there in each of those two buildings, Christ Church and the Wesley Chapel, now Wesley Monumental. I think the year was 1978. I was still a college student, was invited to go to a conference with some older adults with the church in Palmetto where I grew up. Well, John Wesley eventually became the founder of the Methodist Church. But early on, when he was a young man, he was a priest of the Church of England and was sent to Savannah, Georgia in February of 1736, early on as a colony, to be one of the chaplains of the colony. Well, he did not do well with either the colonists living there in Savannah, nor the Native Americans who lived not too far out of town, with whom he was also supposed to minister. He also fell in love, but was rejected. And when he left Savannah, he was downcast, sailed back to England in December of the next year. So he was there probably 18 or 19 months. During Wesley's long and stormy trip sailing back to England, where evidently they had some very bad weather, he was afraid and sick and very downcast because of his experience in Savannah as he was going back to England. And it was one of the lowest points of his life. But he was impressed by the spiritual faith and the depth of a group of Moravian Christians who were also on the same ship. He saw in them some things that he wished for himself. And so when he got back in England, a few months later in May of 1738, he went to a Moravian prayer meeting, a small group who were meeting in a home on Aldersgate Street. And John Wesley was moved in a very deeply, in a very personal way. This changed him personally and as a minister. It led him to reach out to everyday people, not just people that would come to the church for worship, but to the large number of workers who had moved to the cities in that day and age to work in factories as part of the Industrial Revolution. He formed some small groups that were called the Methodist Society because they were very methodical in their organization. And later on, of course, rose out of that eventually the Methodist Church. So the serendipity for Wesley was that he discovered an unlikely gift, or he discovered a gift in an unlikely time and place. He had been at the lowest point of his life. He had failed miserably in ministry and in his personal life. John Wesley didn't know what he was looking for, but he found a deep personal faith and a spiritual awakening. Perhaps as a young man he was blinded by pride when he thought he knew he was better than the others, and that seems to come through in the way he preached and acted with the people in Savannah. Perhaps he had grown up and knew just the form of religion and not the substance that was there. Perhaps he was just a young man who needed to mature a little bit more in his life. Either way, he found himself changed in a very profound way. So serendipity. What might you and I today discover in the unlikely places in our lives? It's a good question. As I look back over my experience, I have had several times of serendipity in my life that were important. When I was a student, I had several teachers or mentors who gave me opportunities that I did not seek out or even know existed. Inez Pettigrew, my 5th grade teacher, encouraged me to join 4-H and compete in a public speaking contest. Guess what I'm doing today? My chorus teacher in high school, Bob Dittman, pushed me to try out for a role in musical theater at school, and he also taught me to be the conductor for the high school chorus. I enjoyed both very much. Larry Cook was the pastor when I was around that age. He helped me lead in worship services because he needed some assistance. And although I didn't realize at the time, he was coaching me to become a leader, not only at that time in the church, but also in years to come. After school and seminary, and I returned to Florida, in Sarasota, my first congregation, I was serendipitously appointed to serve with a man named Walter Rutland, a wise man whom I had accidentally met about a year before, and in whose home I had stayed as a guest, simply because I was providing a ride back to school in Atlanta for one of his daughters. Serendipity. Well, throughout my career, I've had a few moments. I became a hospice chaplain, to be honest, mostly because I needed a job. And I thought it would be just a short-term solution. I ended up finding a meaningful career that spanned 18 years. And in 2013, as I was settling into a new position with the hospice at that time, and thought things were going to be settled for a while, I received a phone call from Marie Caulfield. Some of you may remember Marie. She was an old friend of mine and the first chaplain here at Village on the Green. She was retiring and said she had an opportunity for me. I had never thought of working in a retirement community and didn't really know what Marie was going to try to get me into. But one thing led to another, and now I look back on nearly 7 wonderful years as your chaplain here. Well, we are in the time of COVID. That's the phrase I like to use. So what might you and I discover in the unlikely times and places in our lives when we are not expecting, but perhaps there's something for us after all? During the time of COVID, we have to deal with isolation and learn what it means to cope with and try to survive and thrive while we are isolated. Sometimes that might involve us being more self-motivated than motivated by others or a calendar or something that draws us to somewhere. It's been sort of up to us when we're isolated. In the time of COVID, many of us now treasure even more than before the value of family or the socialization times together, even if they were just casual. During whatever chapter of life in which we find ourselves, perhaps there is a serendipity moment awaiting us. Retiring was probably a challenge for many because suddenly you go from something that's productive to what do I do next? Learning to adapt and find self-worth as an elder person in our society, I think, might be an opportunity. Aging and health always bring challenges, and so there are opportunities there too. And we also, as we live, we have to adapt to changes in our families, changes in our society, things that we wish might stay the same but do not. We do live in times when we have soul searching. What do I really value? What's the basis for my faith? How do I want to invest my time and energy? Sometimes moving to Village on the Green or having other things change in our lives raise these important questions. And of course, throughout life, we have times of disappointment. Perhaps when we have flat out failed at something and have to face that reality. A serendipity moment might allow us to think about, what are my resources? How do I find reserve when I feel depleted? How might I get up after I've fallen down? What might I learn from this experience? What might I share with others? And of course, we all have times of grief and loss. And we learn about how to cope with sadness. Cherish memories and make them precious even more so than before. And find value for our days because we know those days here at least are limited. So when we cannot see ahead of us, we may end up with a serendipity that helps make it a special time in our lives in spite of whatever else is going on. So let me encourage you and I, because I learn a lot when I have these talks. We of course should take seriously the feelings we have when we are down. Those are real, those deserve attention, and giving attention to them helps us to heal. We also might look for opportunities to reflect, think about what's going on, maybe learn something new or learn something in a deeper fashion than we have before. I encourage us to pray for openness so that we take in those things in our lives that enrich us and those things that lift up our spirits. So to look and to be open for those opportunities is a great thing. I also think that we can accept that we often discover good things in our life when we've had a little time for it to sink in and we look back on what has occurred and we realize that the pain or the difficulty or the challenges were real, but also carried a gift that we now are able to carry forward. Well, I hope you have a good day, but I hope you also discover that in addition to the energy it takes sometimes just to survive a difficult time, that you also discover and experience perhaps a new opportunity, learn something new, deepen your faith. May you have a moment or a time of serendipity where a gift comes to you in spite of whatever else is going on. Have a good afternoon. May you have a good